Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Reserve Funding Methodologies. This webinar is sponsored by Association Reserves. My name is Paige Showerman and I'm the Marketing Manager for Association Reserves. I'll be serving as your moderator for today. Today's webinar is part of a series of monthly webinars that we'll be hosting. Each quarter, we'll have a series of 3 webinars: Fundamentals of Reserves, followed by Reserve Funding Methodologies, and concluding with a special Ask a Reserve Specialist session. So if your questions aren't answered here today, we'll be dedicating a special webinar in July to give our audience a chance to submit whatever questions they'd like and have them answered live by a subject matter expert. Today's class, Reserve Funding Methodologies, is a 1-hour webinar designed to help understand the reasoning behind reserve funding and to explore the critical differences between the straight line method and the pooled method of reserve funding. I believe you'll find that today's class will have been a great investment of your time. Due to the number of people attending, everyone has been muted, but you can ask questions at any time by typing your question into the question box at the bottom of your control panel. Please make sure to hit the Q&A button and not the chat button. Our Q&A time will be during the last 20 to 30 minutes of the broadcast, and we'll get to as many as time allows. For our licensed association managers attending, this webinar is approved by the State of Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation for licensed community association managers for 1 CE credit related to the CAM certification. I will email certificates of completion to all attendees within 1 week. Please keep in mind that the credentialing committee does track how long you're on the webinar. With that said, we don't want to give the impression that this course is only for managers. Board members, committee members, and residents will also learn a great deal about reserve budgeting and planning and come away better prepared to lead and serve their communities. Also, we'll be providing copies of the slides for today's presentation, as well as a recording of the class. So if you have any colleagues or friends who couldn't make it today, please feel free to pass those along. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Will Simons. Will?
Thank you very much, Paige, and good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you joining us today. I'm going to take a moment here, just kind of introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. My name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with our company since 2008. And in that time, I think I've done upwards of 2,500 reserve studies, something like that. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that is only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. The designation comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. As of now, we have 5 reserve specialists on our Florida staff, but a few dozen more spread out around the country among our other offices. Let's see, I lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community in South Florida. We had a budget there of a little over $1 million, about 635 homes. The reason I point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, having to work with volunteer board members, with committees, the volunteers out there who are taking on this responsibility of managing and steering their community associations into the future. So I do salute those of you out there. I'm glad you're joining us today. We have a lot of good information. Before we move on, I want to introduce one of my colleagues, Abe El Masri. Abe is one of our territory managers, one of our senior staff. He's been with us a little over 5 years now. Abe has a background in civil engineering. He's a credentialed P-Eng, which is kind of the Canadian equivalent of a PE here in the States. He's also a credentialed reserve specialist. He's worked with us on many different property types. And so between Abe and I, we're going to get through the material for you today. Let me give you a little bit more background about the company itself. Our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in business since 1986. We've completed, at this point, I think it's over 70,000 reserve studies for all different properties all around the world. As I mentioned, we have offices from coast to coast and more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other provider. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which of course includes all types of condos, but also HOAs, timeshares, other residential properties. We also have a great deal of experience working with other property types. So office buildings, hotels, resort facilities, worship facilities, marinas, country clubs, so on and so forth. One thing I always like to point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, we are not an engineering firm, we're not an accounting firm, but rather we're a very specialized consulting firm, which is focused on doing this one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that help them to forecast and budget for major projects. If we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help them to design, they're able to reduce the risk of financial distress, which comes in the form of special assessments and bank loans and other types of problems. If you want to get any more information about our company, you see our website down there in the bottom right of your screen, reservestudy.com. I'll also have my email address up on the screen at the end of the session, which is wsimons@reservestudy.com. Okay, so for now, before we get into the material, Abe and I are going to turn our cameras off. We'll come back on screen again in the Q&A portion at the end. But let me give you a quick preview about what we'll be talking about today. All right, so just to get us started, I want to give you this very brief outline or overview of what we're covering in the class. Really, we just have two sections. The first one is focusing on the philosophy or the reasoning behind why it's important to have reserves at all. So Abe's going to talk to us about that. In other words, why is it not okay for associations to just pass special assessments or go out and borrow money every single time they need to take on a big project? In our last class, which was last month, the Fundamentals of Reserves course, we talked a lot about the percent funded concept. That's going to be very important to understanding some of the material in the later part of this class. So if you happen to miss that one, if you want to go back and watch the recording, we do have a YouTube recording of that one. We get into kind of the methodology, the concept, how do you calculate percent funded? That's a critical piece of information to understand. So we're not going to review that here today, but I do encourage you to go back and review that if you're not familiar with percent funded. Once we've kind of moved on from there, we're going to get into the heart of this course, which is a detailed overview of the two different reserve funding methodologies that are used. Those are called the pooled method and the straight line method. Okay, so without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Abe, and he will begin with our first section today. Abe, take it away.
Thanks, Will. All right, we can begin with the basic question of why have reserves? Just to put this in perspective, first I'd like to pose a hypothetical question to all of you out here. And the question really is, what are reserves for? Why do associations even collect reserves? And the question really poses itself is it to save this money for the here and now, the present day? Or is it really more for saving for future projects that can happen many, many years down the road? And I think the answer may surprise some of you. So I'll give you a second to think about it. All right. So oftentimes when we ask this question in a live setting, we'll ask everybody to give a show of hands between the here and now and the future. And you'd be surprised, most of the time we see more hands go up for the future. But I think it's a critical point to make and to explain that reserve funding is really more for the present day. It's for the here and now. I think it's a misunderstanding to think of reserve funding as saving up for some project in the future. And the reason why that's not a great approach is because oftentimes there is a very good chance that the current owners that live in an association won't actually be there in time to see this project come to fruition. So it may seem to make sense to these unit owners that they should not be funding reserves towards some project out in the future that they won't be around to benefit from. So if you think about it in that sense, it sort of makes sense, but I would encourage you to think of it in a different way. Instead, if you think of reserve funding as paying the current bill of deterioration that is occurring in the present day, I think that is the more appropriate way to think of it, sort of like a pay-as-you-go model. I'll give you a quick example just to reinstate that. Let's say that I buy a brand new unit in a brand new condo building. And let's assume that this condo building has a roof with a 20-year lifespan. And let's say I plan to live there for the first 15 years of that building's existence. And that means I'm going to enjoy 15 years of use and value out of that brand new roof, not to mention all of the other building components that I'm benefiting from as well, like the mechanical systems and the amenities and so on and so forth. Now, let's say I want to sell my unit. After those 15 years, I decide to sell my unit, and the incoming buyer plans to live there for the next, say, 15 years as well. Now, keep in mind, only after 5 years that they buy into this new unit, this roof is now going to need to be replaced. So this is where it gets sort of tricky. If I had not been charged accordingly during the time that I lived there, meaning if I wasn't contributing the correct amount towards the cost of the roof replacement project through reserve funding, then the new buyer is essentially going to get stuck with the full cost of the replacement project. So at that point, they will have only lived there for 5 years, and now they're getting hit with the full cost of replacing the roof, which really isn't fair to them. So essentially, they are paying their share of the life of the roof, but also my share, even though I've moved away. So you may be wondering, so what? What does this all mean? Well, if you're that second buyer and you are deciding between associations to buy into, the fact that my association doesn't have a healthy reserve fund means that you, as the new buyer, are going to be exposed to more cost and probably a higher chance of a special assessment to make up for the years during which I was not being charged the correct amount. All right, reserve rules. So in our business, we talk about these 4 reserve rules. First, expenses are inevitable. They are bound to happen whether we like it or not. There's no getting around the fact that your AC will need to be replaced at some point, your elevators will need to be modernized, and your roads will need to be repaved. Number 2, the board is responsible. They are elected members that are entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all the unit owners. Next up, delaying projects. This is very, unfortunately, this is very common. We see this a lot. When projects are delayed, they tend to get more expensive. And specifically, we see this all the time with roof replacements, concrete restoration, and other exterior components. So by kicking the can and delaying projects down the road, you are not saving money. It's actually the opposite. And then most importantly, homeowners will get stuck paying the bill. There is no Uncle Sam or government bailout for community associations that don't have adequate reserves. All right, so how do we fund these projects? Just as there are 4 rules for reserve planning, there are 4 options for how to eventually pay those bills. The first and best option, of course, is to have a healthy reserve fund. The second best option would be to pass special assessments when projects come along. Now, it should be obvious that it's a bad situation when the second best option comes with a skull and crossbones warning on it. So if you've ever managed or lived in a community association that has recurring special assessments or are in the habit of constantly passing assessments, you'll know exactly what I mean by that. It's very toxic. It's not a good experience for anyone. The next best option would be to take out a loan or a line of credit from a bank to pay for this project. Now, the reason why I have this ranked after the special assessment option is because, of course, the cost of the project when being funded through a loan or a line of credit will be greater than say a special assessment, because you are financing this project. You will be paying interest. Now, these are the three options. So the question poses itself. So what happens if we don't do any of these three? Meaning we don't want to reserve the correct amount of funds. We don't want to assess any of the unit owners. We don't want to go to the bank and pull a line of credit or get a bank loan. Well, then your only choice is to let the property fall in disrepair. If you don't pay any money out of pocket up front to take care of your community, then in turn, it will suffer. Property values will take a hit, and it just won't be fun living there anymore. All right, so benefits of funding the reserves. Some good news. So here are some of the specific benefits of funding the reserves, starting at the top. You shouldn't have any financial surprises, or at least a lower chance of getting hit by a surprise. If you're funding reserves correctly and you're paying attention and you're tracking the remaining life expectancies of each of the common components that the association is responsible for, this will give you the option to plan ahead and prepare for what needs to be replaced, and kind of taking on a proactive approach as opposed to being reactive and getting caught by these surprises whenever something fails. When you're planning ahead, that also gives you the chance to shop around and select from different providers. You know, having time on your side will give you that ability to seek out more bids and try to minimize the cost by working with various contractors. And timing is key. For example, you can talk to your painting contractor and find out when might be the most advantageous time of the year to have your buildings painted, right? On the flip side, if you don't do that and you're more reactive, then if you're just calling out a contractor on an emergency basis, because say your elevators are down on the 4th of July, then you're going to get stuck paying a higher fee, and it's just going to be super rushed, and it's no fun for any of the unit owners. The point here about minimizing exposure is mostly relevant to board members. What I mean here is that if you're proactively taking care of the property, you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty, which will give you better protection overall against any potential complaints or possible lawsuits from the owners. The last point to make here is that if you're doing all these things, that will naturally lead to increasing property values. In our experience, I would say communities that are doing a good job of reserve funding tend to have better curb appeal, are more up to date with respect to technology, and have more modern amenities than those that don't reserve at all. All of this contributes to, you know, a better ownership experience for the people who live there, which in turn obviously makes them more attractive to potential buyers. All right, so, and last slide for me, what happens if we don't set aside the correct amount? Well, the opposites are true. If you don't have a healthy reserve fund, you're more exposed to surprises, which can eventually lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, and ultimately declining property values. And I would say the real issue here that we tend to see with communities that get into this vicious cycle is it becomes very, very difficult to break out of it.
Let me unmute myself there. Abe, great job. And yeah, I can think of many buildings we've been on together that were good examples of ones that unfortunately had not been doing a good job of reserve funding, and we see how that plays out all the time. So thank you for that first section. Now I'm going to pick up here with the second portion of the class, maybe what a lot of you tuned in to hear about today, which is talking about the two ways that associations actually calculate reserve funding contributions. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what we call the straight line method. The other term for this method is called the component method. And the reason for that is because all components here are treated separately from a funding standpoint. So Personally, I've always thought of this as the old-fashioned way. More and more communities are switching to pooled reserves now, and never looking back. Part of the reason why this is the old-fashioned way is because prior to 2002, at least in the state of Florida, it was the only option. It was the only approved method for funding your reserves. So the way I like to characterize this method is to point out that it's kind of simple in theory, but it becomes very troublesome, very problematic, very complicated when you actually try to put it into practice. So just to kind of talk it through, to help us understand the method, I want to give you an analogy here. So I think it's helpful if you think of each category of reserve components as being handled, as being funded by separate buckets of money, okay? So for now, for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that we're talking about these 5 buckets, these categories: roof, elevator, painting, mechanical, and pavement. When you're using this method, you determine the amount of funding going into each bucket every year using a pretty simple, straightforward calculation. Basically, all you're going to do is you take the cost of that component, subtract out any existing funds that are already saved for it, and then you take the remaining difference and divide that by the remaining useful life of the component as measured in years. The result of that calculation will then tell you the amount that is required to, quote, fully fund that component in the following year's budget. All right, so just to make it more clear, let's use this roof reserve category, this roof bucket, as our first example. Now, if you understand that the total volume of the bucket represents the total cost to replace this roof, and then you look at the existing cash, the existing roof reserves on hand as being the existing contents of that bucket, the difference, the empty portion up here, this is something that we can call the unfunded balance. Okay, it's simply just the difference between the total cost of replacement minus the existing funds that you've already saved. All right, so if we put some actual numbers on this example, let's say that our total cost to replace the roof, we've estimated at $200,000. And let's say we've already got $140,000 in that roof reserve account. That means then we have an unfunded balance here of $60,000. Okay, pretty simple math. Now what I need to do is determine how much I need to be funding this roof reserve going forward in my annual budget. So I take my $200,000 cost, subtract the 140, that gives us that $60,000 unfunded balance. I'm then going to divide that difference over this remaining useful life. And let's say we've determined that the remaining life on the roof is only 3 years. So 200 minus 140, we get 60,000. 60 divided by 3 means that we need to put aside 20 grand a year into reserves for the next 3 years, right? 3 years of remaining life, 20 grand a year in order to fully fund that roof. Moving forward, you have to go through this and do this whole exercise for all the remaining buckets to finish your budget, right? And, as you do this each year, you can play that out over time. You can see or imagine how you might end up with a variety of different funding positions, right? Depending on how accurate your assumptions were for life expectancies and costs, some of these accounts may be very well funded while others are not. Now, if you look at this in totality, in terms of the total cash on hand, I would say this makes for an inefficient distribution of all the association's actual cash, right? You might have money that's locked up in one account when it would be very advantageous to take some of that money and move it to another project that's maybe a higher priority. This is where things start to get very complicated. Some of the specific problems that we identify with this straight line method, first of all, it's very often the case that there is no prior reserve fund that's been established for some key component, right? And we see this quite often when a community has been relying on a developer budget for some number of years, right? That initial budget maybe never included something like concrete restoration, or the funds might be too broadly defined. For example, we'll quite often see one large combined account that's just defined as mechanical. And in theory, that mechanical reserve is supposed to capture everything from security cameras to fire alarms to cooling towers. The problem is all of those have very different life expectancies, very different replacement costs. And if you're combining them into one big broad category, now you have to start to do some complicated math to find out how much of that bucket, how much of the funding is going into each of those various components within that account. From a management standpoint, okay, for the managers out there, hopefully you can appreciate that this component method can be much more of a headache. The reason for that is that under this method, the statutes require that the owners would have to vote to approve the moving of funds from one place to another. So going back to that bucket illustration, say you've got money in your elevator reserve, you want to move that to parking lot reserves or vice versa. You have to get a quorum of the owners to get together and vote for that. And we all know that getting a quorum and passing a vote for anything in a community is a very difficult task. I would say that's especially true when it comes to moving money around, right? Residents are often very skeptical of their boards. They're hesitant to give that approval unless they fully understand the situation. That often means that the board, the manager have to call special meetings, send out tons of emails, maybe get even attorneys involved, and so on. Now, lastly, I think it's pretty clear the most serious problem with this method is that because it is more conservative, associations are not making the most efficient use of the sum total of all their available money, which means that ends up costing the owners in the association more money each year in the budget to fund according to this method. So just to give you some real perspective on this, at the end of each year, as a company, we look back on the hundreds of reserve studies we've produced that year, and we look at the funding recommendations that we put out for our clients that are using this straight line method, right? When we do their reserve studies, we will certainly give them the recommendations based on this approach, but we'll also give them a comparison to show them what happens if you pool your reserves so they can see what the difference might be if they go that route. And every time we've done this, again, using pretty large sample sizes, hundreds of reserve studies, what we found is that the average difference is about 200%. All right, so let me say that again. What I'm saying is, on average, those clients that are using the straight line method would require triple the amount of money from the owners if they stay in that method, as opposed to if they pool their reserves together, okay? Now, given that basically every single association out there is always trying to cut their costs, lower their assessments, come out with a budget that's a little more user-friendly, one easy way we're able to help them do that is to teach them about this concept, about pooling the reserves. Once they do that, more and more associations are making the switch each year and enjoying a budget that is a little bit easier on their owners. All right, so let me tell you about this better option. This is called the pooled method, also known as the cash flow method. And in our opinion, this is absolutely the better way to go. Okay, so just for background, as I said earlier, this method has only been approved in Florida since 2002, it's 20 years now. But I can tell you, again, because we're a national company, outside of Florida, this method is universal. Okay, this is, in 49 other states, this is effectively the only approach that people use. I can tell you that with confidence because we have 12 offices throughout the US, and our Florida office is the only one that ever has clients using the old straight line method, okay? So just to contrast it from the straight line method, you could say that the pooled approach maybe is more complex in theory, but I think once you get the hang of it, it's actually much simpler to use for your annual budgeting. I'm going to talk about the kind of the technical, calculation of it here, but in a moment. But before we do that, one of the questions that I always would get when I gave this presentation is, if we have straight line reserves now, but you've convinced us, right? We're interested in switching to this pooled method. How would we do that? So I put in this slide here to talk about that process. First and foremost, you need to understand the board of directors can create a new pooled reserve account all by itself. Okay, so for example, the board could say, as of this upcoming 2023 fiscal year, all of our new incoming reserve money is going to go into this pool of funds. Okay, that itself does not require the owners to vote. It's only if the board wants to move money from those existing straight line accounts, those buckets, into this new pooled fund, that's when the owners have to vote and approve that. Okay, it's basically the same idea as moving funds from one reserve account to another. It's considered a non-scheduled use of those reserve funds. So the same voting process is required as if you were moving money, for example, from painting reserves to elevator reserves. Now, the good news is that this is a one-time process. You don't have to take that vote every year when you adopt your budget. And lastly, I would highly, highly recommend that if you're considering going this route, talk to your CPA, maybe talk to your attorney. If you've got a reserve study provider, definitely involve them in the process. Make sure that you're going through this process correctly. You don't want to mess it up, but once you do pool your reserves, I can absolutely tell you with confidence that's going to be a better situation for your association. Okay, so going back to kind of the technical side of this, the best way that I've found to explain this method is to go back to that same bucket analogy that we used when we were talking about straight line. Only now, what we're going to do is take all of those separate buckets of money that we talked about in the last few slides and imagine dumping those into one big bathtub. Okay, once you've done that, you've essentially removed the labels from any specific categories or types of reserve funds. Instead, now all you have is one pool of funds that is collectively available for any component that's on the reserve schedule. There is no such thing anymore as a roof reserve dollar as compared to a painting reserve dollar or an elevator dollar. It is all just reserve money that you can spend much more effectively, much more efficiently. So we're going to talk through the process of how you would develop your annual reserve budget using this pooled method, but it's very important to point out that the first step of the process is exactly the same whether you're using straight line or pooled. Okay, the foundation of any good reserve plan is an accurate component list, right? It doesn't matter which method you're using if the underlying data for your physical elements is not reliable. Okay, so once you have that list of reserve components, you know what your life expectancies are, what your costs are to assign to each of those things. Now you can look forward and start to design a timeline of future expenses. Okay, it might look something like this. Most reserve studies will include something like a 30-year forecast. And what we can do with this forecast is to show you what approximate amounts are going to be spent in any given year. Now, the underlying data there is always tied back to the life expectancies and the cost for those components. We see when something's going to expire, we can forecast what it will cost, and we put together a big picture overview that looks something like this. Once we've done that, okay, once we know what the future expenditures look like, the next step is to determine how much money needs to go into that pooled reserve account every year in order to meet those expenses. Now, this is a fairly straightforward process, but I'll try to walk you through the steps. Okay, the first thing to do is to determine where you're starting from. What is the sum total of your reserve accounts or your new pooled fund at the start of your fiscal year? The next thing you're going to do is you're going to plug in some assumption, some amount for estimated income to reserves. Now, this can be a combination of contributions, actual cash from the owners, but also interest earnings. Okay, so this is one way we already have a nice advantage over the straight line method, where you can't really forecast future interest earnings towards your overall income assumption. Okay, the next step is to go back to that forecast of expenses and look at what's coming up on the schedule. What are the estimated costs coming up in that first fiscal year? From there, you're going to do your math, right? Take your starting cash position, add in your assumption for income, your reserve contributions, your interest earnings, and then subtract out your reserve expenses for that year. Okay, that will then leave you with a new account balance going into the following fiscal year. You just roll that forward. You look at the start of the next year. Obviously, you've got to make sure that you still have some money left. If not, back to square one. You would then need to plug in a higher contribution rate because you're obviously never allowed to design a plan that takes you below zero. Right, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, I'm talking about this kind of 1 year at a time, but the beauty of doing this with an Excel spreadsheet or other type of software is that you can set up a model that takes the same types of projections for many years at a time. It only takes you a few seconds to set up some formulas that will show you how much money you're spending in total over all these remaining years, and therefore how much money you need to contribute each and every year in order to keep your account balance at a safe level. Now, that leads me to a very important point. There are absolutely some differences of opinion out there over what is considered to be a safe level. Okay, basically, there are three possible funding objectives that people talk about, which are called baseline funding, full funding, and then threshold funding. And I'll break each one of these down in that order, starting with baseline funding. Okay, I'm not going to minimize this or sugarcoat this. Baseline funding is the riskiest option on the table. Now, it is perfectly legal to do, but for most communities out there, this is not a good idea. Basically, when you're baseline funding, the objective is you're going to figure out what is the bare minimum amount of money that I need to put into reserves each year to keep that pooled account balance above zero throughout the entire timeline, 20 years, 30 years, whatever the forecast is going to be. Now, this is something I want to make really clear. When we talk with managers, with accountants, with board members out there, it often seems that there's a disconnect in the terminology. And the problem is, if you talk to most people in Florida and you ask them what they mean by, quote, fully funding a pooled reserve fund, what they will describe to you is what I'm now telling you is actually baseline funding. The reason for that is it's the minimum required by law unless you get a vote of your owners to approve something less. Okay, so what a lot of boards, what a lot of managers want to know at budget time is what is the amount of money that we need to put into the budget each year so that we don't have to have our owners vote and approve something different. And the law says that that amount, that number that needs to go into the budget to avoid that voting process, is the amount that would be required to keep a positive cash balance in the reserves throughout the timeline. And in this context, anything above zero is considered acceptable or sufficient. Okay, so this is the actual language that you get in Florida legislation with respect to pooled funding. Basically says that your contribution rate needs to be enough so that over time, your cash inflows are greater than your cash outflows, but that's basically it. There's no other requirement to go along with it. Now, if you actually take the time to read the legislation, the term fully funding is actually not used anywhere with respect to the pooled method. The closest thing you can find is the term sufficient funds. Now, in fact, the DBPR, the Department of Business and Professional Regulation, they have a manual that they've published, which is a guide that's very often used by managers and board members. And the manual explains how to design a pooled funding calculation. Now, this is real, this is true. In the example that they use in that manual, the association in question gets to a point where they only have $4, not 40,000, not 400,000, $4 in their reserve account. And this state in this manual says that is sufficient. Now, before we go on, I'll just pose a hypothetical rhetorical question to you guys. Does anybody out there, whether you're a board member, manager, or somebody else, do you ever think it's a good idea for any type of community to have $4 in the reserve account? Obviously, we don't think so. I hope you all recognize that's a very dangerous approach to take. Because obviously, if you're just doing the bare minimum, it only takes one problem to blow up that plan. That could be a project that happens a little earlier than you anticipated, or something that costs a little bit more than you thought it would. The point is that if you're trying to thread the needle that closely, you have no margin for error. And in turn, the chances then that you'll need special assessments or loans become very, very high, right? Now, if one of the main reasons to fund reserves at all is to try and prevent that from happening, I think you could argue that that's just not a reasonable strategy for anybody to adopt. If you look at this table here, this is a real world example of what baseline funding looks like, right? So we adopted this after a client that we had worked with, and I just want to show you what you're looking at on this table, okay? Up at the top left corner here, this furthest left column, this is the 30 years of the financial plan, starting from the current year, 2022, running out over the next 30 years. When we move from left to right here, you see you've got different numbers that correspond to this particular fiscal year. First one is the starting pooled account balance, which we then compare to this fully funded balance as of that year, which tells us how to calculate percent funded. Now, again, if you missed the prior class, the fundamentals of reserves class, where we talk about percent funded, highly recommend that you go back and revisit that, because you want to understand what percent funded means and how that is a measurable risk factor for associations. Okay, but once you do that, once you understand what percent funded means, now you can determine what the percentage is in terms of a low, medium, or high risk position. All right, still on this first row, moving to the right now, we see a column here, which is the projected reserve contributions for that fiscal year. How much are they putting in the budget to put into reserves? In this case, $70,500. Okay, if there's any loans or special assessments there, you would see that here. Again, we can assume some interest income, and then we would have our reserve expenses, whatever's on the schedule to take place in that year. Okay, now we've got a spreadsheet here, so it's going to make the math pretty easy for us. We're going to have our starting reserve balance, and then we're just going to measure the cash flow. Remember, I said the other term for the pooled method is called the cash flow method. Right, so we're starting at about 1.1 million in the bank, comparing that to their fully funded balance of a little over 1.2 million. This community would be about 90% funded. Okay, very strong position to be. But now, because we're baseline funding, the next step in this model is to figure out how much do we need to contribute to reserves to meet these expenses and keep cash above zero. Okay, so we can do this with a spreadsheet very quickly. We see the cash going in, the cash going out, and each fiscal year begins with the result from the prior year, right? If I took this 1,107,000, added 70,500, added 11,475, and subtracted no expenses, then going into the next year, I have 1,188,975. Repeat that process over and over again. And what we see is that we're going to meet these expenses and stay cash positive, right? We're allowing the community to get down very low, only a couple $100 in the bank. But again, the state would say this is sufficient, okay? Now there's an obvious problem here. In the course of about 12, 13 years, they're going from a position of strength, very low risk of special assessments, but whittling down this account balance, still paying the bills, but totally eating into that cushion that they had, right? So now we get down to this point where there's really no margin for error, and they never really recover after that either, right? They still have more work to do, and they've depleted their funds so much that they never recover back into that strong position where they had that low risk before. So again, understanding that this is considered sufficient reserves by the state, the owners would not have to vote to approve this plan. It's only if the owners wanted to do less than 70,500, because at that point, they're effectively guaranteed to run out of money and need special assessments in the future. Okay, I'll talk now about the minimum requirement. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. This is the most conservative option, what we call full funding or fully funding the reserves. Now, I'm going to be careful here when I'm using this term full funding in the context of a pooled reserve account. I'm using the definition that comes to us from National Reserve Study Standards, right, which is up on the screen here. As I said before, most people in Florida have a concept of fully funding, which is what I just showed you in the last few slides, but we now can recognize that's actually baseline funding. So there's some history on this, right? CAI, the Community Associations Institute, they adopted these National Reserve Study Standards way back in 1998, right? Full 4 years before the state of Florida allowed pooled funding. Now, if we could travel back in time and be in the room, it would have been very nice to point out that, hey, look, there is existing terminology here. Why don't you just call it what it is? But that ship has sailed. Here we are. The point I want to make is that the definition of the term full funding means setting the objective to attain and maintain reserves at or near 100% funded, right? It's not a cash dollar measurement anymore. It's measured in terms of percent funded, which is again why it's so important to understand that concept. So how does that look? Okay, let's use the same example as before, but this time we're going to design a plan that has them attain and maintain that position of becoming 100% funded. So again, very important to understand the expenses on the far right. These are identical to what I showed you a moment ago. The starting cash position is identical, that 1,107,000, right? They're 89.9% funded. The only thing that's different here is that we're seeking a different objective. Now, instead of just staying above zero, the goal is to try to reach 100% funded, nice and gradually over time. That requires a slightly higher contribution rate, 94,500 instead of, I believe, 70,500. But the advantage of doing that is that not only can they cover their expenses, but they're also increasing their account balance relative to the fully funded balance, which in turn increases percent funded. It means they never slip into a high risk position. This is another way to look at this comparison. Okay, so on this chart, we're looking at percent funded here on this left-hand vertical axis. On the bottom, horizontally, we're looking at the 30 years in the plan from 2022 and beyond. If you look at the starting point, again, remember they're all starting in the same position. We're just analyzing the difference between these two strategies. Okay, and the green dots here represent percent funded over time based on fully funding, right? Seeking 100% funded. They gradually, steadily reach that position and stay there. The orange dots on this represent the baseline funding plan. Now, if you look at that closely, it actually looks pretty good for the first 10 years or so. But you have this one major project that effectively wipes out that reserve account and leaves them with no margin or very little cushion there. So the percent funded effectively falls off a cliff. It recovers slightly. We let it get down to that point where they have $245 in the bank, and then they kind of get back up on their feet a little bit, but never to the position of strength that they were at before. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of cost? All right, so the baseline plan in this example, we talked about that required $70,500 in contributions, whereas the full funding plan required $94,500. That's a difference of about 34%. Now, actually, curiously, that is a larger difference than we would typically see. In most cases, the difference between baseline funding and full funding is more like 15 or 20%. But let's just stick with this example. Even at 34%, in this real condo example, that amounted to $15 per unit per month. Okay, think about that for a second. Less than $1 a day per owner meant the difference between doing the riskiest allowable strategy and the safest, most conservative one that would do them the greatest benefit long term. Okay, $15 per unit per month. Keep in mind here, we're also comparing against the status quo. That's the purple dots here, right? This is what we show the client to tell them, look, if you just keep doing what you're doing, that's not going to work at all, right? And it goes down to zero, actually below zero. They would need a special assessment and probably many more along the way. So the point is, look, you have to increase your reserve funding no matter what, but while you're at it, why don't you do that in the most responsible way possible so that you never get into hot water again in the future? Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this next option here, but it's pretty simple to understand. Basically, threshold funding means picking any objective between baseline and full. So you could say you pick a target and then you design your funding plan accordingly. So for example, you could say, instead of seeking 100% funded as our target, let's say we want to just become 70% funded. Or another way to say it is, we want to make sure we never drop below $1 million in our pooled reserve fund, right? You pick some number and you solve for that. One of the problems with this approach in my mind is that it's a lot more subjective, right? You can have a board in one fiscal year that decides that they want the threshold to be 50% funded, but then the next year you've got a new cast of characters in place and they say, no, the threshold is 20%. We're good with that. That will have a very large effect on the amount of money that goes into reserves from one year to the next, right? Now, we do often do these. Typically, it's a unique scenario where we're designing something specific for a client based on a hypothetical input, something they want to see. But as we talked about on the last slide, when you look at the cost difference, it usually just makes a lot more sense to fully fund than to pick some arbitrary specific threshold target. Okay. We got only about 3 or 4 more slides here, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. So I do see some questions already coming in there. Feel free to answer or to ask those questions now, and then Abe and I will get through those as best we can at the end. But for right now, I'm going to talk to you about one of the most frustrating parts of being a reserve study provider in Florida for the last few years. On this screen in front of you, I've got a paragraph which I copied from the Florida Administrative Code, which is basically the state's official interpretations of what they have written in the statute. In this section where they talk about pooled reserve funding, they have this one sentence at the end that I highlighted here in red, which talks about the funding plan not allowing for balloon payments. Now, I'm very confident that when they wrote this sentence, they had good intentions. I think the inspiration behind this was to prevent boards of directors from intentionally kicking the can down the road. But the term they used in this context, balloon payment, has a very different understanding in most contexts. Okay, the general understanding of that term, balloon payment, typically describes a situation where, for example, let's say you have a mortgage, and for the majority of that mortgage, the borrower pays a certain amount of money each month, and at the very end of the term, they make one single final payment, which can be much larger than any of the payments that came before it. We used to see these a lot with adjustable rate mortgages back in the day, right? Now, if you think of that in association terms, it makes sense why that's not fair. Basically, they wouldn't want an association to do some small amount of reserve funding for many years, and then at some point in the future, plug in a much higher amount of funding in one particular year when a big project is going to take place. Okay, so for example, let's say we're talking about a townhome community that needs to replace its tile roofs. That will almost always be the largest expense in their reserve schedule by far. Okay, let's say that that project is scheduled for 10 years from now. The board that is sitting in place today might be tempted to say, look, we're doing our long-term planning. We can get away with doing a much lower amount of reserve funding for the next 9 years if we assume that 10 years from now, when we have to do the roofs, we'll just plug in a really big number for reserves, and that's going to cover the cost of the project in that year, right? What they're doing in that scenario is committing that future group of owners, right? The ones who will be there 10 years from now to pick up the tab. They would be the ones paying that quote balloon payment. And that, that would allow the owners in the present day to get by with doing a lesser amount of funding, but that's not fair. I understand why they would want to put a stop to that. So if you're thinking, well, so what? Well, this is the rub, this is the problem. Over the last several years, it's come to our attention when we're talking with our clients and with their accountants who are conducting their annual audits, that the DBPR has taken this term balloon payment in this context, and they have interpreted that to mean any increase whatsoever in the contributions to reserves. Okay, so for example, if we tell a client this year they need to contribute $100,000 to reserves, and that's based on an analysis where we've looked at the current replacement cost for those things and we factored in their remaining life expectancies. But next year, if we're reasonably assuming that costs will go up to inflation, and we're going to try to help them keep up with that inflation, next year, have you contribute $103,000. And then in year 3, if costs continue to go up, as they always do, contribute a little bit more, and again and again and again, all the way down the line. Now, for many years, we did it that way and always thought that seemed very reasonable. The problem that we've recently run into is that the state is saying, no, you can't have any increases in your contribution rate. That's a balloon payment. And our response has been, well, wait a minute, you're allowing us, maybe even encouraging us to use some assumption of inflation in our reserve studies, right? That means that the cost of the components that this association is saving for will be increasing over time. We all agree on that, but now you're telling us that we're not allowed to assume any increase on the contribution rate, the money going into reserves. It's a major problem because now, if we all agree that inflation is real, and it certainly has been the last couple of years, and that costs will go up over time, but when doing the reserve study, we're not allowed to make the same assumption on the other side of the ledger, right? That the cash going into reserves can increase to meet those rising costs. Well, now it gets a lot more expensive to make that plan work, okay? In other words, we're allowing the assumption that expenses will go up, but not allowing the assumption that income will also go up. Now, if I still need to create a plan that meets some specific criteria, whether that's baseline funding or full funding, doesn't matter. In order to cover those rising costs, all else being equal, I would have to plug in a much higher contribution rate in the start of that plan in order to meet the same objectives. Doing that would place an unfair burden on the current owners, okay? The people who live there now. In that scenario, they're expected to pay more than they should for reserves, right? Now, we've complained about this, and the response has always been, well, then just take out inflation, right? Don't assume that costs will go up and that should balance things out. And Abe would certainly agree with me. This is the part that gets under our skin, right? We're in the business of delivering financial recommendations to our clients. And we have been told that one of the key underlying factors when you're making a long-term forecast should just be removed from the plan. That doesn't feel right to us. No one in their right mind assumes that something that costs $10,000 today is still going to cost $10,000 15 years from now. I don't think there's really any aspect of the economy where that's ever been true. But in order to make this plan work, it's the only logical conclusion. We would have to take out inflation, which then allows that level funding amount to be more appropriate. Now, this is where you guys come in. What does that mean for managers and board members? The message that we all need to reinforce to associations is that budgeting for reserves is an annual exercise. Okay, they cannot have a reserve study done 1 year and expect that they can use that same document for 3, 4, 5, 10 years in a row, especially if there's no inflation in those assumptions, right? Every association out there needs to produce a new reserve schedule every year as part of the budget, which should be based on the market pricing for components at that time. The only way, that is the only way that you can realistically keep on top of things. So in the same way that you have an annual audit done, you should have an annual reserve schedule done, whether that's internally or you hire a company like us to do that for you. But that's the bottom line, right? If you're working with a reserve study provider and they're not allowed to include inflation, then it's incumbent upon the association to go ahead and do that for themselves on an annual basis, keeping track of how those costs have changed. Because if you don't do that, any forecasting into the future is going to be unreliable. So the good news here, there are some low cost options for doing annual reserve study updates. There's third-party software you can purchase out there that you can use at budget time. Hopefully this is going to change, right? We expect that it will. This whole balloon payment interpretation thing is probably going to go away. We can get back to making realistic assumptions again. But our company and many others in the last few years have had to remove inflationary increases from our reserve studies. So again, it's critical to keep in mind that those studies have an expiration date. They are only as good as the data that goes into them. And if you're allowing your association to make decisions based on unrealistic information from 1 year to the next, that's not going to end well. Okay, some final thoughts here before we open this up for Q&A. If Abe and I have done our job here today, hopefully everyone agrees that reserves are incredibly important for associations, both in the present and in the future, okay? When you're designing your annual budget, we want to encourage you to think hard and to choose wisely about which method you're using to do that. And once you've chosen that method, I'm not making any secret about this. The pooled method is by far the way we would encourage you to go. Make a smart choice about what the objective of your funding plan should be. Okay. Always keep in mind when you're crafting the annual budget, the goal is not to keep the dues low. It's not to keep your members happy. Okay. Whether you're a leader in the industry or at your community, if you're a reserve specialist, a property manager, just a board member volunteering for your association, it is all of our collective responsibility to educate the people that we represent and to help them to make wise financial decisions. So with that, we'll start with the Q&A in just a moment. But before we do that, let's turn on our cameras again. And I'm going to have Paige go ahead and launch the poll for us. Paige, are you able to do that?
Yes, let's go ahead and launch it right now.
Okay, so thank you for that. Everybody should see that CEU class poll pop up on your screen. We'll give everyone some time to work on that. We're going to take, maybe 15, 20 minutes or as long as we need to try to capture as many of these questions as we can. Just a couple, I haven't looked at any of the questions yet, but just a couple housekeeping notes. We're not attorneys, so if any of these questions are looking for legal advice or something that's very specific to your governing documents, this isn't the right forum for that. We would probably encourage you to talk to your attorney. If it's something that's very specific about a particular financial situation to your community, and we wouldn't be able to advise you without actually doing a reserve study, then we'll probably have to forego that question as well. What we're going to try to do is capture as many broad topics that would affect the most amount of people as we can. And, if there are other questions that you wanted to go over after the fact, I've got my email there up on the screen, so feel free to jot that down. And yeah, we'll go ahead and and start just going down the list here. So again, I haven't seen these before, but we're going to do our best to answer them between Abe and myself. As I expected, just looking at the first couple of questions, there's a lot of people asking about the new legislation in Florida, Senate Bill 4D, which just passed on, I believe, May 26th, so not even a month ago. I'm just going to kind of go off the top of my head here and give you my general thoughts on this new legislation. So for those that don't know, I'm going to try to summarize some of the key points of what the new requirements are, and then give you more kind of color commentary about how we got here and where we're going to go in the future. So for background, obviously we are, about 3 days away from the 1-year anniversary of the Champlain Towers tragedy, right? June 24th of last year, building fell down in the middle of the night and was an immediate tragic wake-up call for everybody in the industry. From that day forward, the Florida government, the legislation, wanted to propose some new laws or requirements that would hopefully prevent that from ever happening again. So as of last fall, they started drafting some pieces of legislation that would greatly reform a lot of the existing condominium requirements. And a lot of that came down to how buildings would be inspected, how they would be budgeting for reserves on an annual basis. And long story short, you had a group of people in the Senate and a group of people in the House, each drafting versions of legislation that carried through the winter months into the spring. And we got to March when the regular session of Congress was ending, and there was a Senate bill and a House bill, and they had certain things in common, but couldn't agree, couldn't compromise on some of the key provisions in the bill. They effectively ended in a stalemate before anything would go to the governor. So nothing got done. The session ended, no bill was filed, nothing happened. From then on, I think there was quite a lot of, rightfully so, criticism within the industry, within the general public, saying, how can this be? Well, something's got to change. So you fast forward to May, and the legislature was called into a special session by the governor to address the insurance crisis in the state. And as they were working through those discussions, those deliberations, in late May, it came back up on the table that, hey, look, why don't we do something for condo reform as well? And this bill, this Senate Bill 4D, was the result of that. It was kind of piggybacking off of some of the legislation that was talked about earlier in the spring. But long story short, in less than 48 hours, with no public input, no consultation with any industry experts or anything else, the legislature passed 4D. It was signed by the governor, and it will effectively go into effect December 31st, 2024, unless it's amended or revised prior to that. What does that mean for associations? A couple major factors here. There's actually a lot to this bill. It's over 100 pages long. If you have some time, I would encourage you to either read through it or at least watch one of the many webinars that have been put out since then. They've got a lot of great law firms and other experts talking about the new legislation. But there's some good things in the bill. There's a lot of good intentions behind it. More disclosure of information to building departments, to potential buyers, to owners. Generally speaking, they want to put a lot more information out in the open. We totally agree with that. That is good. Those of you who may be in Miami-Dade and Broward counties, up until now, you've been familiar with the 40-year certification requirements. One of the major provisions of this bill is that they've expanded those requirements statewide, all 67 counties in Florida, and they've reduced the timeline for having these inspections done. They're now going by the term a milestone inspection. So if your building is within 3 miles of the coastline, as soon as the building is more than 25 years old, you have to have your initial milestone inspection done, and then every 10 years after that. That means you're going to bring in a licensed architect or engineer who's going to go through the entire property, inspect the structure of the building, the electrical components, life safety, a whole host of other elements of the property to make sure that everything is safe. I mean, that is the spirit of this bill. If you're more than 3 miles from the coast, the first inspection is required at 30 years. Remember, so in Dade and Broward, it was 40 years. They've reduced that to 30 or 25 if you're on the coastline, as many properties are. In either case, it's every 10 years after that to have that milestone inspection done. So that is one thing. So if you're in a building that is at least 25 years old and on the coast, or 30 years if you're inland, you are now going to be subject to this new milestone inspection. I'm generally in favor of that. I think that's a good thing. I think that's kind of the equivalent of a person as they age going to see more specialists, right? And doing more cancer screenings, let's say, getting a CAT scan done. These are the things that we need to do as we age to make sure that we're going to be around for the long term. Buildings need to do that as well. I think it's fair to say the most controversial aspect of this new legislation is another new requirement, which is for something called a structural integrity reserve study. Now, that term has never existed before. There has never been a structural integrity reserve study, to my knowledge, ever done in the United States. It doesn't exist. The legislature opened that up, and they created that, and they have defined what they mean by that. But at this point, our company and no other reserve study provider in Florida that I'm aware of has ever done such a thing or has any immediate plans to do so for a number of reasons. The structural integrity reserve study, for one thing, says that the visual inspection portion needs to be completed by a licensed architect or engineer. That has never been a requirement anywhere in the country up till this point. Everybody has always understood that a reserve study is a financial planning exercise. It's a budgeting tool. It's not meant to take the place of a structural evaluation when those are required. But that's what they said, is that the visual inspection has to be done by a licensed architect or engineer. And these structural integrity studies need to be done at least every 10 years. Now, they're not tied to the age of the building. So if you're in a new property, you would still be subject to this new SIRS. Let me give you just some general numbers on this. I mean, there are about 36, maybe let's say between 35 and 40 credentialed reserve specialists, which are what Abe and myself are in the state of Florida up to now. There's, from what I understand, something like 650 structural engineers that theoretically would be the folks capable of doing this type of inspection. I think you could further drill down. It's probably a much smaller number of those that would be available to do that would be interested to take the work on, and that are in a position to even try their hand at doing a reserve study. Now, let's talk about how many buildings are subject to this requirement. It's somewhere between, I think, 25 and 30,000 condo associations that have now been given about 30 months to do a structural integrity reserve study. There's not enough manpower in the state of Florida to make that happen. Especially if it's going to be a requirement that the visual inspection has to be done by a licensed person. So how do we respond to that? Well, we're figuring that out really as we go along. Like I said, it's been a matter of weeks. I've had discussions with several engineering firms about possibly combining services together. They do some portion of it. We do the reserve study portion of it. That may become a possibility. But the short answer is that we don't know. And I guess the longer answer is that we fully expect a new bill to come out. You know, from the evening this bill was signed, I had already been getting rumors that a glitch bill, or what they call a cleanup bill, would be following in its wake, possibly as early as next spring, which I think might separate these two things back out. You have your milestone inspections done by a structural engineer or some other licensed professional, and then you have your reserve studies done for budgeting and planning. And the reserve study should absolutely reference any milestone inspections or other work that's been done by that building to make sure that it's as accurate as possible. But combining these two into this new kind of Frankenstein sort of service has never been done before. And we're quite honestly at a loss for how to do that. What we're telling our clients is that we can do reserve studies for you, and you probably should seek out a structural engineer to do your milestone inspections. But these two are not the same thing. So we're actively working through as many channels as we can to provide influence and education, and hopefully that will be made clear. But as it stands right now, a structural integrity reserve study has to be done at least every 10 years, and the visual inspection has to be done by a licensed architect or engineer. So I'm going to take a pause and have a sip of water here, and then kind of look back over the list and try to see some of the other questions. A lot of you are asking about this legislation. That is my take on it. We will absolutely have more information to come as we get more information, as we talk to more companies and figure out how to interpret this. But as it stands right now, I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. All right, so let me kind of click off some of these questions. One of the attendees is asking, are you allowed to use the pooled method for the structural integrity reserve study? The answer is yes and no. So one thing that this new bill claims is that there are now structural elements to a property, and you could just categorically say other elements. So the structural elements that would be subject to this structural integrity study, I think there's about 9 things on the checklist: foundation, load-bearing walls, floors, roofs, windows, plumbing, electric, painting, waterproofing, and fire protection systems, I believe. And then anything else with a replacement cost over $10,000, which would materially affect any of the other things on the list. My understanding is that the legislation does not want to allow pooled reserves for those things, right? So in other words, you can pool your reserves for other things: hallway renovations, lobby remodeling, swimming pools, tennis courts, mechanical systems. But this is another example where the legislation, to me, is pretty short-sighted. That's a very impractical application. What do you do with communities that already have pooled reserves? How could they possibly break up a pooled reserve account into these various categories? So we honestly don't know how they intend to interpret that. That's maybe a better question for an accountant, but we will hopefully get some more clarity on that soon. Let's see. Our condo has waived reserves for over 25 years and had no problems. Special assessments work just fine. They save owners thousands of dollars and allow owners to invest their savings, not give them away where they can never retrieve them. Why can't we continue to waive reserves? I understand the individual motivation behind that. Special assessments may work just fine in some cases for some buildings. But I would say that Champlain Tower South is a great counterexample to that. That was a building that relied on special assessments as much as they could, but they got to a point where they were so financially behind that they could not special assess enough money quick enough to deal with the problems that were manifesting at the building. And it all came crashing down, quite literally. It's not okay to do that. It's not fair to do that. In 49 other states, owners are not allowed to waive the reserves. So Florida is really not doing anything radical here by disallowing the waiving of reserves going forward. They're just making it the way it is in the rest of the country. This will, make sure that associations are funding evenly, that everybody's paying their fair share. As Abe talked about in the beginning, everybody will pay a portion of the deterioration for these projects along the way, whether or not they actually live in the building when the project actually takes place. That's the only way you can effectively make sure that everybody's paying the true cost of ownership during their time in the building. Otherwise, it's a game of musical chairs, and the bills all fall onto one group of people who are just some unlucky group that happens to live there when all the work gets done. That will have a downward effect on property values if buildings are relying on that approach. Let's see. Abe, do you see any good questions on here that you might want to jump in on?
There was a question here about asking how many years with full funding would it, I think they meant to say, would it take to reach 100% funded? Mm-hmm. It really depends on the position that the association is in financially. Yeah. Every association is different, right? If you have been setting aside the correct amount for the past 10, 20 years, obviously you're in a better position than, say, someone that has been completely waiving reserves or partially funding the reserves. So it really depends the position that you are initially in and how long it's going to take you to get to that 100%. But generally speaking, reserve studies provide a 30-year timeline, right? Meaning we take you from your current position and we eventually land you at 100% over 30 years. Right. But some will do it quicker than others, obviously, depending on the situation they're in.
Yeah, and some can elect to get there sooner than others, right? You could have two communities that are each 50% funded today, and one might say, we want to get to 100% funded over 30 years, as you suggested. Others might say, we want to accelerate that timeline. Within 10 years, we want to get there. Now, that will require a higher amount of money in reserve contributions, but they will get to a stronger position faster, and that may have some benefits to their owners and to potential buyers, right? That's another perspective we always want to encourage is think about your building from the perspective of somebody who wants to buy a unit there. What would be important to them? And I think one of the major underwriting criteria, one of the decision points people are making when they buy a condo now is, does this building have reserves? Do they have a reserve study? Do they have a history of special assessing for everything all the time? Because if they do, that means I'm going to end up picking up the tab for somebody else who lived in this unit before me. And maybe that's not something I'm interested in doing, or something I'm not willing to pay as much to live in this building now because I'm going to get hit with these other costs. So yeah, good question there. Let's see. How do I find the YouTube session on percent funded? We'll send out a follow-up email. Paige will have that. We'll include a link to last month's course, the Fundamentals of Reserves. So we will gladly put that out there for you guys. Let's see, Abe, I like this one for you. Can an allowance be placed as a pooled component in the reserve study? And maybe I'll give you an example, like an allowance for plumbing or an allowance for concrete restoration. What would you say about that?
Yeah, absolutely, you can. Yeah, so there are certain projects by nature, they're just unpredictable, and you wouldn't really know the extent of this project or how long, how much it's going to cost. It's very hard to gauge. Like, for example, if you have an AC unit, which is very objective, you can tell, more or less how much it's going to cost. But if you have something like concrete restoration, for example, very unpredictable, it's very tedious. You're going to have maybe a structural engineer come out and, literally start tapping away at walls. And if they find more work that needs to be done, this project could go from, 500,000 to 2 million. So when you have projects like that, the best way to go about it is to put some sort of allowance. Another example is plumbing. It's very rare you'll have to replace all of the plumbing in a building. Instead, you'll have, certain stacks that will need to be replaced. And the best way to go about that is to include an ongoing allowance.
Right. Yeah, it's those are both good examples. I mean, when you have a project that is not done in its entirety, you're doing a portion of this work on a fairly regular basis. If you can look backwards and see on average how much you're spending historically, I think plumbing's maybe the best example of this. Just model that assumption into the future. If you've on average been spending 25 grand every 2 years on plumbing repairs, and that's a pattern you expect to continue, you can budget an allowance for plumbing work like that going forward. Let's see, there's a question here. We are thinking about changing to the pooled methodology. Is this the right time? I would say absolutely. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. Pooling is, again, it's universally used outside of Florida. The only hesitation I would have on that question is what the interpretation of this new legislation is going to be, if they're going to restrict pooling of reserves for certain things. I would challenge the legislature to explain what they mean by that and how that would effectively take place. But generally speaking, pooling is very advantageous for communities. Let's see. Yes, we're going to be sending out copies of the slides. We'll send out PDF copies, and also a recording of this. This whole session is being recorded. So if you got the emails to register, you'll be getting the emails with all the follow-up. That's all public information. Feel free to share that with as many people as you like. Okay, let's see. It's about 2:20. I want to maybe just go through a couple more questions just to keep everybody's time in mind. And again, I'm trying to look at some of these things that are maybe applicable to the largest group of people. Okay, here's one. If our association shifted to pooled reserves, how do we stop a majority group of board members at any time from spending too much from the pool reserves on a pet project, understanding that boards come and go? So that is the only criticism really that I've ever heard of pooled reserves, is that when you put all the money in one place and you allow the board to spend it on any reserve component, technically speaking, all that money is available for anything on the list. Now, there's a couple points to make here. This does not create a slush fund, right? You can't just use your pooled reserve fund for any spending that the board wants to do. They can't go out and throw the world's greatest New Year's Eve party with that, right? It is still only limited to the reserve components on the schedule. So how do you stop a majority group of board members from behaving badly, let's say? First of all, board members are subject to fiduciary duty responsibility. If they are not acting in the best interest of the association, if they are in violation of what's called the business judgment rule, their directors and officers coverage does not protect them from individual liability. Okay, so if there's a building out there with a leaky roof and elevators that don't work and a fire alarm system that's obsolete, and they take all their reserve money and spend it on remodeling the lobby, that is very clearly not a good business decision, right? That's, to me, a pretty easy claim to say that's in violation of the business judgment rule. They're not acting in the best interest of the property. And as such, if something bad happens, they are subject to personal liability for that. You know, even though it's a volunteer job, board members are also subject to, I think it's statute 617, the Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. They have to discharge their duties as a board member with the best interest of the association in mind, not the best interests of the board members who sit on the board at any particular time. Another creative way I've heard to put a stop to that is to write it into your documents, right? So each year you have a reserve schedule done. You could put in some amendment or provision that says any spending that is in excess of, you know, X% of the stated cost for this one component requires a majority vote of the owners, right? So if you have, for example, estimated hallway renovation as $100,000 and the board wants to spend $500,000 on it because they want to go way above and beyond and turn it into the Taj Mahal, you can put a stop to that by writing an amendment that says the owners have to vote because that's, you know, in excess of what had been previously anticipated. So to me, there are checks and balances there. Quite honestly, folks, the pooled reserves are not abused. If they were abused, we would hear that in all 49 other states where they're universal. It just doesn't happen. I think boards are there to try to do the right thing for their communities. I think they understand the responsibility there. And if they breach that responsibility, that duty, then they can be held accountable for that. All right, I'm going to try to pick out maybe one more, and then we'll wrap it up for today. But again, really appreciate all you guys joining us today. We will have another session next month. Next month is going to be our general Ask a Reserve Specialist session, which is entirely Q&A. So if I didn't get to your question today, please feel free to sign in next month and we'll have a full hour of just Q&A there. All right, Abe, are you looking over the list? Anything else that you think might be good to address before we wrap it up?
Yeah, there's one that says that asks if an association asks you to run the reserve study with the inflation factor turned on, can you do that? Yeah, we can actually. So keep in mind, we don't have an issue with including inflation. Really the issue here is the Florida Division of Condominiums and Timeshares. They're requiring for reserve fund plans to be presented without year-over-year increases, and they're referencing this whole balloon payment thing. So really, the issue is not inflation; it's the year-over-year increases. So we can include inflation in the reserve study, but you just have to be mindful that this will place an unfair burden on the current unit owners, because if you look at a 30-year plan, you're going to have components that are increasing or are getting inflated in cost year over year, but you're not allowed to offset that with these reserve contribution increases. So that's kind of a tricky one, but yeah, absolutely, we can run it with inflation.
Yeah, and we did do that for 35, 36 years. This is only in the last 18 months or so that we started doing this without inflation. Our software can absolutely include that. We can show a version of the study that has a table with inflation, with increases. The only risk you run is that when you turn that over to your accountant to do your audit, if they look at that and see that there's increases in the funding plan, then, you know, there have been at least a few occasions I'm aware of where a board has been fined, or an association rather has been fined for an improper budget. So that's really the only reason why we go along with this approach. And if you don't like that, if you don't like any of the stuff I've been saying about this new legislation and the cost that's going to place on owners, I would encourage you to reach out to your representatives, your representatives, your senators for your area. They are going to be hearing a lot about this from a lot of people in the next few months. And I think, again, there's a lot of good in this legislation. There is a lot that could be improved upon. And we as a company, along with many others, are going to be there to try to help out and provide whatever influence that we can. So stay tuned. This is a developing story. Again, this is all less than a month old, and we're going to be here to provide the best guidance that we can. With that, we'll wrap it up for today. I want to thank Abe. I want to thank Paige for helping me put this on today. It's been great to chat with you guys, and we look forward to the next one. So we'll be following up with everybody soon by email with the recording, with the copies of the slides. And thanks again. We'll see you next time.